Professor Bird, I want to pick up now the mortality data in relation to hepatitis C infections with people with bleeding disorders. So if we go back to the report, page 19, electronic page 23, back to that summary table. So we've looked at the column about HCV infections, and if we now look at the column in relation to deaths, and I'm going to do it data set by data set, if I may. So the UK HCDO report, the figures that we have there, around 700, and that's of the 2,400 confirmed cases, 39% from HCV-related causes. And then from the additional possible of at least 2,400, around 1,400 deaths. Can you help us understand how those figures have been extracted and the degree of confidence that there might be in relation to them?
It might be helpful if we looked at a later part of the table, which would be table 2.3, on which is, at least for males, on sorry, I do beg your pardon, figure 2.1 on page 31. The panel A, so this is for the well-defined subset of the National Haemophilia Database, and looking at 4 of those subsets, those who were HIV infected, who are also, as we know, co-infected with hepatitis C. And the 4 colours here refer to different epochs of follow-up, from 1992 through to the end of 1999, then from 2000 to the end of 2009, and then from 2010 to the end of 2013, I think it is, and then from 2014 to the end of 2019. The reasons we've chosen those 4 epochs of follow-up are that the 1990s were a period when there was treatment available for hepatitis C disease, but it was difficult to tolerate, it was interferon, and it wasn't highly successful. And also that period was the period during, about midway through that period, we started to have highly active antiretroviral therapy. And so for the subsequent periods, as you'll notice from panel A, for the group who are HIV infected, the pale blue line goes down considerably compared to the dark blue line, which is probably associated with the highly active antiretroviral therapy. So sort of almost a pharmaceutical solution to the HIV problem. The reason for the next epoch, leading from 2010 to 2013, is that is just before we have the directly acting antiretroviral therapies which help to clear, to give you sustained virological response from hepatitis C. And so you'll see in the top panel for the HIV infected and co-infected all-cause mortality, the rates of all-cause mortality go down considerably over those successive epochs. If we turn then to those who tested HCV antibody positive, and you'll remember those are just those whom the database knows were tested, and we don't necessarily know the test date. What you'll see in the column for death rates per 1,000 person years of follow-up is that the all-cause mortality is actually increasing for those who tested antibody positive. Whereas in the bottom bar, those whose HCV status was not known but were exposed to pooled plasma products, they have quite high death rates in the first 2 epochs, and then a bit of a decrease. And that's partly because these people also had fairly severe bleeding disorders, haemophilia A, predominantly. And then the panel on the right-hand side tells you for each of those 4 subgroups the cause of death, well, certain selected causes of death. And so, of course, for the HIV-infected persons, the very high rates are evident there. For also for hepatocellular carcinoma, I beg your pardon, and HCV-related liver failure, because again, the HIV-infected persons were co-infected with hepatitis C. And whereas for those who tested hepatitis C positive, you'll see the blue lines being lower in terms of death rates per 1,000 person years for hepatocellular carcinoma and liver failure, but gradually increasing over time with the longer exposure to that infection for those who tested antibody positive. So it's a long way round of answering your question. It is essentially the proportion of the total mortality that was due to HIV hepatitis C related causes that is where that 40% came from in the table that you looked at originally. But I should add that we now know, which we didn't necessarily know at the end of the 20th century, we now know that hepatitis C affects other organs besides the liver. So it can affect the heart, the kidneys, and the brain. And again, that is information that we've acquired both through record linkage of the hepatitis C register against the deaths register, and because of basic laboratory work that academic hepatologists have done on the effects of hepatitis C. Sorry, it's
and just picking up on that last point, this data here is the well-documented subset within the National Haemophilia Database. That's obviously only part of the overall picture. What, if anything, are you able to tell us about mortality rates more generally in relation to this cohort of hepatitis C infections in people with bleeding disorders?
We've focused on the well-defined cohort because we feel we can say something fairly reliably there. And I would expect that for a given category, for instance, those who are hepatitis C antibody positive, that the proportion of their deaths that are due to liver-related causes would be representative of potentially what we are seeing in people whose HCV test status we don't actually know about. But there are limitations to the generalizations that we can make from these data.
In relation to what you've said is the increasing knowledge and understanding that hepatitis C affects organs beyond the liver.
Yes.
Does that have an effect on the reliability of some of the data in terms of death? Because the link between the hepatitis C and the death may not always have been made. It may be fairly straightforward to say, well, hepatocellular cancer, that is the result of the hepatitis C. But if, in fact, what is recorded is something which has affected the heart, the brain, other organs,
yes,
the connection with hepatitis C may not be made.
That is correct. And so the proportion that are here ascribed as hepatitis C related is essentially liver-related hepatitis C and doesn't account, because we can't, for the reasons you've just explained, for the other part. And how big that other part is, we can learn potentially from other databases, but not specifically here.
So there may be an unknown number of other deaths which were, as a matter of fact, caused by hepatitis C,
yes,
but which it's simply not possible to put a figure on it.
That's right. But we, as we'll come to in Chapter 4, we are there able to put what we think is a reasonable figure on that for patients who were infected via transfusion.
Can I just then ask you to look still in this chapter of the report? It's the last page of this chapter, so it's page 32, internal pagination, page 36, electronically. You've set out a number of limitations. I don't think I need to go through those because you've essentially touched on them in the evidence that you've already given. It's just the point at paragraph 230 in relation to Penrose. There's a difference essentially in the figures as you've calculated them from those that are set out in the Penrose report in relation to this cohort of patients. Are you able to assist us in understanding how that might have arisen, or why that might be the case?
Not exactly, but my inclination would be to go towards the higher figure in the Penrose report, because for that report in Scotland, there was work done between the National Haemophilia Directors Organisation and the clinicians in the individual centres in Scotland to, as it were, reconcile. And so my instinct would be to suggest that probably the figure that is in the Penrose report is the more appropriate one for Scotland.
Going to turn now then to the third category that you examine in your report, which is HIV infections in transfusion recipients. So if we go to page 33 of the report, so 37 electronically, and we see that again the summary findings, which were at least 79, possibly up to around 100 people infected with HIV through blood transfusions. And then around 85% having subsequently died. Now that's based on, as you say there, a data set provided by the UK HSA, and we've already explored what might be some of the limitations of that data set. Professor Spiegelhalter, could you perhaps just talk us through these figures here and how those have been reached?
Yes, if we could, it might help just to turn to the table where we go through that in a bit more detail. Table 3.2.
So page 35 or electronic 39.
So this is data which have been directly provided to us by UK HSA in their spreadsheet. If you remember, they classified the groups into haemophilia, other blood products and undetermined blood products. So this is just looking at the central column of other blood products. We see in diagnoses there's a total of 241, 79 acquired, this is up to December 2000, 79 acquired in the UK, 137 acquired outside the UK, 25 in country of infection not reported. So we got there a kind of minimum of 79 known cases diagnosed through other blood products, which again is, as we described before, is a somewhat imprecise category. There's two reasons why that 79 will be added to. First of all, that some of these have country infection not reported, not so many, and so some of those 25 were no doubt acquired in the UK. Our guess is not that many, and one reason why that could be the case is that if you look at the mortality rate of those acquired in the UK, it's extremely high, 85%. But if you look at the mortality rate of those acquired outside the UK, not reported, it's 44%, which is close to the value acquired outside the UK. So there's some suggestion that those country infection not reported, again, supports the idea that most of those were acquired outside the UK. It's interesting to see that mortality rate being so much lower. There's all sorts of reasons for that.
And I mean, one of the questions I have been asked by those reading the report to ask you is, why is there that apparent difference on these figures? I know the numbers are not vast, so I don't know how much significance
I think
attached to them.
I mean, again, people acquired outside the UK and then come to the UK. One of the simplest thing is only survivors who will come into the UK. And so sort of perhaps early deaths of untreated HIV will never appear in the database. So there is considerable selection of cases of those acquired outside the UK. So that's one reason for that. So the country infection not reported may add some to the 79, not that many. The bigger source possibly of that being an undercount is the other category, which is the blood products undetermined, which we talked about in relation to the deaths of people with blood disorders. And there were 182 of those, the majority of whom we judged would be, in fact, be with people with blood disorders, but that left 50 or so that, again, this is purely based on a statistical allocation pro rata according to the rest of the data, that perhaps 50 of those would have gone if it had been known under other blood products, and maybe about 20 then would have been, according to this, acquired in the UK. So that's why we're, can give, sort of very rough idea of what we might add 20 cases perhaps to that 79. I should in fact add, and we perhaps should have put this in the summary, that there is supporting data for that from the Eileen Trust data that perhaps you want to.
I'll come on to the Eileen Trust in a moment. If we leave that aside for just for present purposes and look at this data from the UK HSA data, I think you used a moment or two ago in one of your answers the verb guess, and
I don't like your word guess. I mean, maybe a judgmental estimate.
Would it be right to say that all you can obviously be confident of, or relatively confident of, the lower bound, 79, but in terms of the then up to around 100, it could in fact be rather more than that if you build in, depending upon how many of the country of infection not reported you allocate to the UK, and then in terms of the third category, the undetermined, depending on how much you allocate to haemophilia or transfusion.
Exactly.
And then build in too, perhaps, the fact that the UK HSA database itself is not necessarily comprehensive.
Yes, yeah. I mean, and you can see that happening throughout our report, that we're giving fairly confident lower bounds on many of these numbers, and quite rough upper bounds, particularly in the previous chapter on hepatitis C in people with blood disorders. And but this one, I think, the 100, we put 100, and we, definitely say around 100. I think, again, this is a judgment that there's no reason to think it would be substantially higher than that, and that, as I said, judging by the other data that we've got, I think that's as good as we can do, and say that is our rough judgment of the upper bound on this.
And then just in relation to the Eileen Trust data, if we go to paragraph 3.7, so it's page 37, electronic page 41, there's reference there to 74 cases of HIV after transfusion in the UK reported prior to the Eileen Trust. And the origins of that, I think, I don't think we need to go to the underlying document, but it's a document, I think, from the early 1990s, which reports 74 known cases, and at that point 17 where country of transfusion was unknown. That won't capture, of course, people who may have died by that stage, second half of the 1980s, or who may never have made an application to the department and been registered with the Eileen Trust, may not even have known that transfusion could have been the root of their infection. So again, that's a lower bound.
It's definitely a lower bound, and it's lower than the confirmed bound we've already got from the UK Health Security Agency. And so while we can be confident about this lower bound, we have to make a judgment about the possible upper bound for this. And we can only use the data we've got, and our judgment is that around about 100. My personal feeling is that in that range, 79, it's near the upper end of that. We're talking about around 100 cases.
My recollection of the evidence that we had from those who were involved in setting up the Eileen Trust was they expected somewhere in the, I forget whether the figure was certainly 100, but it was whether it was up to 150. Can you recall? Ms.
I
Richards?
can't. If Ms Scott was here, I could ask her because she tends to know the data in relation to the trust and schemes
But it
off the
was,
top
it
of
was
her head.
somewhere in
but
that,
I can check.
that order, which suggests that those people who were involved, at least in the civil service, and those who were involved in setting up the Eileen Trust, thought there might be that many. That was, I suppose, closer to the actual origin of the data, although it wasn't data-based, as far as we know, and may give an anecdotal assistance to setting up a band. I don't know.
I
Sheila, if you could.
might just mention that in distinction to patients with bleeding disorders who were HIV infected, those who were infected through transfusion had a median age of 60 to 69, and the modal age group was 70 to 79. And roughly half of those people will have died because of the reasons they had transfusion within a year. So that may explain a difference between the expectation, if you don't take into account the high mortality rate anyway following transfusion.
Yes, thank you for that.
And then just before we leave this chapter, if I can just pick up on the point in paragraph 3.6 on the screen, where you say this: the Penrose inquiry reported at least 18 HIV infections from blood transfusions in Scotland, and then reference to the data on which that was based. And then you say this: in comparison with our estimates for England, this is somewhat higher than we would expect from simple considerations of population, indicating a higher HIV risk by transfusion in Scotland. Are there any conclusions that can be drawn from that?
Can I pass over to Sheila for this? My Scottish colleague.
We don't, of course, know the background for the 18 HIV infections by blood transfusion in Scotland. But what we are aware of course, is that Scotland's HIV epidemic, as well as having had an injector focus, particularly that in Edinburgh. And so that could be part of the reason that there could be a higher risk from the blood transfusions for Scotland. The other might just be, again, the work that was done for the Penrose inquiry to bring together the records of, in almost a record linkage manner, the records from Health Protection Scotland and the Blood Transfusion Service.
And just picking up on the first of the 2 points you made there, Professor Bird, so it could reflect a higher proportion of HIV in the donor population.
Yes, yes.
Could I just make a point that our estimates of this are tied in with the estimates of the number of people being infected with HIV with blood disorders, which we discussed earlier. In that, because of the undetermined blood products category,
Yes.
where do we put them? If we make one number higher, the other number goes lower. And because of how in the first instance we had these other supporting evidence, which gave us considerable confidence that the majority of those with undetermined source would be in the haemophilia category.
But would it be right to understand, however you divide up that category,
Yeah.
looked at more globally from the inquiry's perspective, those are all infections which it's reasonable to assume are the result of either blood or blood products?
Yes, yeah, I think we can be confident.
I'm going to, for present purposes, skip over chapter 4, come back to it. It's going to take rather a long time to unpick, and just go to what might be the two rather shorter exercises of looking at chapters 6 and 7. So VCJD and then hepatitis B. So if we just go to chapter 6, so it's page 91 of the report, so 95 electronically. And then we have there, again, the summary findings, which we looked at when we looked at the executive summary, 178 cases of confirmed or probable VCJD in the UK, out of which 5 were blood-borne infections. And then you set out a number of matters of background, which I don't think I need to ask you about. If we go to page 93, so 97 electronically, this is the information that you had from the sources you've discussed there, the National VCJD Surveillance Unit's annual report. These are the known cases of transfusion or blood product-related VCJD. And just so that we look through them briefly, so case 1, VCJD via blood transfusion, with a recipient who then developed VCJD symptoms and died over 6 years after the transfusion. Case 2 is the second case of VCJD via blood transfusion. A patient received blood in 1999 from a donor who died of VCJD in 2001. That was confirmed at autopsy, so without VCJD symptoms having developed in lifetime, as I understand it. Case 3 is the case the inquiry is very familiar with, having heard the very moving evidence of from Mr. Buckland Senior, the young man who developed VCJD 8 years after transfusion and died. And then case 4 is a man who received blood from the same donor and also developed VCJD symptoms and died. And then case 5 is the one of the 5 cases which was haemophilia related, severe haemophilia, and positive for the abnormal prion discovered on autopsy. So those are the 5 known cases about which you are able to be confident that those were related to blood products or blood. In relation to, if we go to just the previous page, paragraph 6.4, is it right to understand from paragraph 6.4 that it's known that there are recipients of donations which were VCJD implicated, but it's not known in relation to all of them what the position is. So some remain alive, some have died, and there's been a post-mortem examination. Some have had no post-mortem examination, so it's not possible to know for certain one way or another if VCJD was transmitted. Is that correct?
Yes, so this is a very good example of the sort of triangulation of record sources that we've discussed before, that may not have happened before, but certainly has happened in relation to variant CJD. So if somebody developed variant CJD who had previously donated blood, then this study of the Transfusion Medicine Epidemiological Review attempted to identify the recipients of that blood, which is now referred to as VCJD implicated because the donor went on to develop variant CJD. And as you may be aware, there is not a test in blood for variant CJD, so we cannot screen the blood supply. But what you can do on the basis of examination of lymphoid tissue, generally at autopsy, in the event, obviously in the event that the patient has died and there is an autopsy, you can examine to see if there is evidence of the abnormal prion in lymphoid tissue, specifically the spleen or the appendix. And so this study identified 67 recipients and is able to give us the current status of those at-risk recipients. So we're referring to them as VCJD at risk. And so 3 of those, as Council has described, went on to develop clinical disease. So we know the outcome for those. 34 died within 5 years of their transfusion, and none of them had developed clinical symptoms of variant CJD, but also there was no post-mortem. So in effect, there is no evidence, one way or the other, because unless you've got clinical disease, the only way you can provide evidence is via a VCGD informative autopsy. And then there were 11 patients who died more than 5 years after their transfusion, and without post-mortem evidence, without post-mortem. And so, again, no evidence. The next row describes that there are 5 individuals who had given permission in life, or there was a coroner's post-mortem, and so they were subject to autopsy. And one of those 5 was positive for the abnormal prion. So if you look at all, and the other 14 remain alive, one of whom has left the United Kingdom. So if you look at that, at the original 67, actually we've got information about 8, and 4 of those 8 either had variant CJD or abnormal prion. So it is really important in this disease, particularly for those who are at VCJD risk, to consider giving permission in life that there would be a VCJD informative post-mortem in the event of their death, because otherwise, unless they develop clinical disease, you won't actually know.
Just a couple of questions I've been asked on behalf of core participants to ask you in relation to this issue, and I don't know whether from your statistical, epidemiological standpoint, they are questions you can answer or not. So if they aren't, please do say so. The first is to say, in relation to the 5 known cases, 4 transfusion-related, 1 the case of a haemophiliac, given the numbers are small in terms of the overall numbers, are there any conclusions that can be drawn from your perspective about the relative risks of transmission of VCJD through transfusion on the one hand and blood products for bleeding disorders on the other? Or are the numbers simply too small to draw any such conclusions?
I don't think I can draw conclusions other than to sort of point out that the patient who died with severe haemophilia, he had also received VCJD implicated product, and there was a study for which that gentleman had given consent that if he, amongst others, was subject to operation or autopsy, that in a way that the tissue could be tested for the abnormal prion, then that should be done. And so that was a consented study, and that gentleman was one of those, I think there were 11 from memory, patients who were part of that study. So these are precious data. It's quite a difficult thing to contemplate, to give permission in life for an autopsy, because one doesn't wish to think about one's own death.
And again, the second question may not be one that as statisticians you feel able to answer, but again, just from the epidemiological evidence, the statistical evidence that you've recorded in the report, does that enable you to draw any conclusions about the current extent of risk for those who have been told in the past that for public health purposes they have to be treated as at risk of VCJD?
Again, I'm in a sense sad to give you the same sort of answer, that the only way that we can relieve those persons who have been told they are at VCJD risk, and the original notification was the thought that their risk might be about 1%, but it was based on a modelling exercise, and of course you can improve the modelling exercise as you get more data. But the only way you get more data in this context is through autopsy. When somebody dies, and if there is not a post-mortem, we don't learn anything that will improve matters for those who are still, as it were, told to take precautions to protect the rest of us. Other precautions, of course, have been taken to protect the blood supply so that those who have received blood or tissue no longer donate, and so on. So, and there's leukodepletion of the blood. So many other precautions have been taken, but we're in the extraordinary situation that there is not a test in blood that is going to give us an answer here.
Can I then just turn to hepatitis B, which is chapter 7, page 95 of the report, 99 electronically. And what you've said, and again, if I just read out the summary findings again, due to the limitations in the data available, it is not possible to answer the questions set with any reasonable accuracy when compared to other infections we investigated. And one of the factors you identify is that the funds are not there as a source of information, because there's never been a fund to provide financial support for those infected with hepatitis B. So you're simply unable to tell us even with numerical ranges, likely numbers infected with hepatitis B through blood or blood products.
Yes, it's my unfortunate job to try to explain why we're not going to answer the question. As you can tell, in the other questions we've been asked, we've been fairly cautious about our statements and our ranges, but here we're not even prepared to give any figure at all.
If we leave aside the position in relation to the absence of funds, so there isn't that source, are you able to assist us in understanding the kind of data that you would have needed in order to be able to attempt to answer this question?
We know there's a good time to explain that, in a way, are two different approaches to this data. So far, we've described situations in which we actually have databases of individuals. We don't know their names or identities, but we actually have counts. We can count cases. Now, sometimes they can only really establish a lower bound, but at least we can count cases. In this case, we can't, because we haven't got a systematic way of identifying people who have tested positive because of transfusion or blood products. And we could, we do say, in principle, when we come to chapter 4, we can see we're in a similar situation with hepatitis C from transfusions, and we embark on quite a large statistical modelling exercise, because we can kind of model the process by which people would have received infections and then had their further outcomes. For hepatitis B, we wouldn't even want to try to do that. Our sources of information would be so poor. The fact that hepatitis B, there's many routes by which that can, come into the population. We wouldn't have any confidence even in a statistical modelling approach in this context.
Okay. Professor Bird, anything to add in relation to hepatitis B?
Other than to remark that, thank goodness, we had a vaccine. So again, pharmaceutical industry, not in the context of treatment here, but vaccination has allowed us to get a grip on hepatitis B. And of course, the testing, as you know, protected the blood supply from the early 1970s. But we don't have information really about numbers of transfusions and what happened to them and so on. And as Professor Spiegelhalter has mentioned, transmission of hepatitis B is has many more routes: sexual, injecting, drug use, blood-borne, but also even through sweat. It's extraordinarily much more highly infectious, but fortunately the carriage rate is much lower. Only 5 to 10% remain as infectious carriers.
So, I note the time. I'm about to embark upon chapter 4, but there may not be much point starting it with 4 minutes to go.
Well, I expect you need some lunch before that, do you?
I think we might all need some lunch before we unpick Monte Carlo analyses and the range of tasks that form part of the modelling exercise described in chapter 4.
Well, we'll take a break then, shall we, till 2 o'clock? 2 o'clock.